All right. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Want to welcome everybody to the April 2018 edition of FSMA Fridays. As always, we're very grateful to have so many of you join us. Looks like we've got a lot of new faces as well. I think probably along with this topic, which we haven't really touched on before for, I guess, partially obvious reasons as this is coming out. We're going to be digging into the Safe Food for Canadians Act today. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get started here. But welcome everybody back, and we're excited to have you here. For those of you that might be joining us for the first time, and the FSMA Friday crew continues to grow, which is really fun, and I think a great sign that we're getting some good content out of these sessions. This is really the longest standing monthly industry update that we started with the Acheson Group, I think over 5 years ago now. So the focus really is to touch on, recent changes, updates, related news, some of the trends that are going on as we've seen it rolled out over the recent years, and then also it's an opportunity, obviously, to hear and learn from and ask questions of really the leaders in this industry with the Acheson Group, affectionately known as TAG, and so they are obviously one of our key sponsors and have just been such a great supporter and partner to work with, not just with our clients, but really in providing this as a service to our friends out in the community, and something that if you continue to get value, we're going to continue to put in the time, effort, and energy to put these on each and every month. And then obviously on the software side is where we do our part at Safety Chain, where we have a food quality management system for food safety, food quality, and supplier compliance. So we got you covered on both bases, but today is really to dig into what's new with FSMA and learn a little bit about this Safe Food for Canadians Act. Before we dig into the good stuff that you came for, just a few kind of helpful tips, housekeeping, if you will. One is we try and keep this pretty informal. I think the phrase I like to use when we're kind of prepping for these is that if we were hanging out at a trade show, chatting at a table, what would the conversation be like? So sometimes these are part training, part conversation, part informal Q&A, conversational. I hope you enjoy that format. We these are important, serious topics, but we try not to take ourselves too seriously. So we hope you appreciate that type of format. The other is this is for you. So ask questions. Get a lot of really great questions during these sessions. Don't be afraid to ask them. You'll notice that the panelists are the only ones displayed on the right. So while we have a large group here, you don't have to worry about your question being displayed to everybody. That being said, if what you ask is maybe a little too specific or gets into the weeds a little too much, we might choose to take that offline, but we do get to each and every question. We try and do as many as we can here, and we'll save those for the end. So as you send them during the session, don't worry, we're not ignoring you. We're just going to monitor those behind the scenes and then cover those in our short Q&A at the end as well. Usually one of the biggest questions, and when you do have a question, encourage you to use the Q&A box. There's a top right-hand corner there. There's a little Q&A icon with a question mark there. That's the best way to send over your questions. Number one question we get is there a recording? And the answer is yes. And so we'll be sharing a copy of the recording along with the slides afterwards. So if you prefer to sit back with a nice cup of coffee and just enjoy the show, you can certainly do that and get the details afterward. And last but not least, we're on a webinar tool, and we all use these things every day. We also know they can be a little clunky. So if you do have any audio issues, we'll do our best to help you. And usually the two go-to moves are either changing your audio source, so you can either use your computer or you can use the phone, or you can always do the old log out, log in magic trick, which sometimes does it in and of itself. So again, as I mentioned today, we'll touch real quickly on just a few updates, but the real focus here is digging into the details of the Safe Foods for Canadians Act, and then we'll follow up with a little bit of Q&A at the end there. So joining me today, coming back, and I have to say, Cameron, we had tremendous feedback, and I'm not just saying that, we really did last month. It was his first time. I didn't say that before last month, but I joked with him. He's now a veteran of FSMA Friday. Did a wonderful job, so we've asked him back to dig into an area that he is quite familiar with the Safe Food for Canadians Act, because he was part of it. So Cameron Prince is the Senior Food Safety Director over at the Acheson Group, and he's got a ton of experience, over 35 years of experience in food regulatory programs in the industry in both the U.S. and in Canada. But probably most applicable to his bio is that he's held the most senior executive position at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, where he was the Vice President of Operations. And so he was part of leading the Food Safety Modernization Initiative that's finally now underway in Canada. And so he's going to talk a little bit about what that means and how it came about. So welcome back, Cameron. It's good to have you back on FSMA Friday.
Thanks very much, Brian. Glad to be here and glad to be able to talk about this topic, which is very near and dear to my heart. So I'm going to take about 20 minutes to go through this presentation. I'll try to do it very quickly and leave a little time at the end for some questions. But before we get into that, I would like to just give you a couple updates since this is FSMA Friday. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that would be great. Yeah, I know there's probably been a couple of newsworthy things since then. So, is there anything you'd like to update us on? That'd be great.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Yes, there's two things that we've looked at in TAG, and you can read about these on the TAG newsletters, which are easy to get at the TAG website. One of the things that's kind of more of a milestone than anything is that I believe it was April 20th, the deadline for FSMA compliance for small businesses has come and gone. So that's an important milestone that levels the playing field and brings more companies under the FSMA compliance umbrella. The other thing that's very interesting in terms of FSMA news is the first-time use by the FDA of the mandatory recall powers. This was related to salmonella found in a product I'd never heard of before. It's called Kratom, K-R-A-T-O-M, which is an opioid-like, similar to coffee product. And this company had salmonella in this product, and there were delays and refusal to recall, so the FDA went in and used these mandatory recall powers to get the product off the market. So, what does that mean? It means that FDA is taking this very seriously, that will use these powers, and it just reinforces the point that when a recall happens, companies absolutely have to 100% cooperate with FDA and work very hard to get product off the market. 99% of the time, that's no problem, but there are circumstances like companies going out of business or management changes that lead to these unusual mandatory recalls. So those are two bits of news. I think, Brian, I'd be ready to move on to the next
yeah, that
piece.
sounds good. I'm going to go ahead and give you controls and let you get through some of the slides you brought today. All right, you should be all set.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Safe Food for Canadians Act, and we're also going to talk about Safe Foods for Canadians regulations. So the Act is equivalent to FSMA, and the regulations are equivalent to the Preventive Controls final rule. So our agenda today is going to be to go over the Act and the proposed regulations, give you an overview of the key elements and impact on current food safety environment. There are three pillars to this initiative in Canada: mandatory licensing for everyone in the food business, preventive control measures, which are very similar to FSMA, and traceability. New provisions have been brought in. So those are kind of the core. And then I'll talk a little bit about the transition steps, and then we'll have some time for questions. So the Safe Food for Canadians Act was actually passed way back in 2012, much like FSMA was passed back in 2011, but nothing could really happen until the rules or regulations are put into place. So Canada's been a bit slower, and the regulations were published for consultation last year, so 5 years after the Act was passed. And the consultations went very well, general good acceptance, but it's a massive regulatory package. So it still has to have approval, and that is predicted to happen by early summer, at the latest in the fall. So it's going to happen in the next few months. And so what drove this act? It was driven by major food safety incidents, such as some of you may have heard of there were 25 deaths associated with listeriosis from Maple Leaf Foods deli meats, and that became a very big driver on the political level in Canada to change the food safety system. It was a good system before, but it needed improvement and updating, and of course FSMA happening at the same time was another huge driver. So, as I said, the FSMA Act in the U.S., Canada need to keep pace and parallel with what was happening in the U.S. Given the amount of trade between Canada and the U.S. and food, it's very, very significant and very important to many companies and many economies. The idea was to move to a single approach for all food regulatory programs, to get away from the sort of siloed commodity type programs where you had dairy inspection, meat inspection, fish inspection, etc. The idea is to have a common approach to all food, and where differences are needed by commodity to allow for those, but generally to take the same approach across the board. And that was easy to do because the mechanism's there, because the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has the equivalent mandate to both U.S. FDA and USDA. So meat, fish, all foods are under the Canadian Food Inspection Agency jurisdiction. The current acts that we're working with now are out of date. They need modernization. Another driver was, and this is a global issue, is that to have better control of the global food supply chain, to control imports of products into Canada, to be sure that those products are safe. Increasing concern with food fraud, food defense, tampering, food terrorism, and this is a parallel to the food defense and food fraud initiatives that we see at both GFSI and FSMA. The old acts had insufficient fines and penalties, and people could get away with things for a relatively low penalty, and it became a cost of doing business. So that's been updated, and it's a much more modern regulatory framework. So in the future, there will be, well, currently you'll see this list of acts: the Meat Inspection Act, Fish Inspection, Canada Agricultural Products Act. Those will disappear when the Safe Food for Canadians is put into place. So the Act will only be actually in place when these regulations pass in the next few months. So we will have a major transition in food legislation at that point. Okay, so what do we expect on this Safe Food for Canadians Act and the regulations that are coming? First of all, I'd like to say that they apply to anybody who does business in Canada, either exports to Canada, is an importer in Canada, is a processor, is a broker, distributor, exporter. So it covers all sectors of the food industry except on-farm. It does not go where basic raw agricultural products are on-farm are not covered here. They are as inputs, obviously, but not in terms of licensing and so on. So this is a very big regulatory initiative. It's, in fact, the largest regulatory change initiative in the whole government of Canada at the moment. It consolidates 14 sets of regulations into one. It does still allow for commodity differences, so there are elements that deal with dairy, that deal with meat, that deal with fish, but generally it's trying to harmonize across all foods. It is a complex piece of regulatory work. There are over 160 pages in the document, so it's a tedious thing to go through, but it is very complex. But I'm going to provide you today with the highlights of what's in it and what's new. And of course, that is the preventive controls, mandatory preventive controls, mandatory licensing, and mandatory traceability. And there's a new piece called incorporation by reference. It sounds a bit bureaucratic, but really what it means is that policies, regulations are governed by policies, and the policies can be changed. So, for example, a meat inspection manual procedure can be referenced in the regulations, and that manual could be changed by the CFIA, and that would essentially change the regulation without having to go through the whole regulatory process that takes several years. Okay, there are, the major impact is that all food businesses will require a license and will have to develop food safety systems. There will be more inspection of companies that were lower priority before. So there'll be a whole realignment of CFIA inspection resources based on risk. Just a small point that fruit and vegetables dealers may be exempt if they're part of the Dispute Resolution Corporation, which is a joint U.S., Canada, Mexico thing. There will be some costs for industry. There will be a cost for the licenses, several $100s. And we can anticipate stronger CFIA enforcement in the future. They will be able to use a new sort of like a speeding ticket kind of thing for food regulatory offenses that's called administrative monetary penalties. And that is going to be something that, an inspection tool that will be used a lot more. There will be higher inspection fees as well. Okay, licensing. So if you are in the food business, and I want to mention here that U.S. companies can apply for and get a Canadian food import license. It's the only country in the world where that applies. Other countries have to have an agent or in Canada, but if you're a company that exports regularly to Canada and you want to set yourself up as a food importer in Canada, you can do so. You have to apply for the license. You have to identify the products that you're dealing with, and you have to demonstrate that you have a preventive controls program. There may be a pre-licensing inspection, but in most cases that won't happen, and inspections will be based on risk. So preventive controls, very much HACCP-based, very much like mandatory preventive controls in FSMA. Not quite the same emphasis with record keeping and verifications on, like in FSMA with allergen, sanitation, and supply chain. It's all there, but it's handled in a HACCP way. This is a big change for Canada because mandatory HACCP was only in several programs. I mean, most companies had HACCP and GFSI, but it was not actually mandatory to have HACCP or anything like preventive controls except in meat and fish. So this is a very good thing that it's now the law. CFIA is taking into consideration GFSI certification and will put that into their risk assessment to determine how much inspection effort will be put on each company. just like FSMA, just to remind everyone that GFSI is a business choice, whereas FSMA and Safe Food for Canadians are the law of the land, and you have to comply. Obvious point, but an important one. Again, preventive controls are based on Codex. For most companies, probably most folks on the line today, there'll be nothing new. If you have FSMA compliance, you can consider yourself to be in compliance with preventive controls for Safe Food for Canadians, and likewise. And there is a mutual recognition agreement between the two countries on that basis. One of the differences is that, and I already mentioned this, is not the same emphasis on verification and record keeping for supply assurance, allergen, and sanitation as we see in FSMA. And also, there is no mandatory training element like we see for PCQI and FSMA. There have to be qualified people running these programs, but the PCQI concept was not brought forward in the Canadian model. And the next piece is traceability. This is actually pretty basic stuff, and what the government has really done is put in law what really is standard practice in all of industry, and that is to be able to trace goods, trace ingredients one step back and distribution one step out. And this is just making that mandatory, and records have to be kept, and CFIA has access to those records, and this is all to facilitate recalls when they happen. Importers will have to be able to trace back to their foreign suppliers, and importers will also have to be able to trace the first level of distribution. This also applies to retailers. So any retailer has to know where they got, food retailer has to know where they got their food. And again, this is part of the overall effectiveness of recalls, to make sure that retailers can trace back to where they received the food from. Here's the point that, again, that retailers have to have traceability records. Restaurants are exempt from this. And I want to mention here that there are a lot of this information is available on the CFIA website, and there's some excellent tools about licensing, traceability, how to get a license, how to build a preventive control plan. So all that is available. And certainly we in the Acheson Group have information as well. So please feel free to contact us. This slide shows the implementation. As soon as these regulations are passed, it will be mandatory for all of the meat, fish, eggs, dairy, processed fruits and vegetables, honey, and maple. Fresh fruit and vegetable folks will have another year, and other foods will have up to 2 years. So there is definitely a kind of a 2-year overall phase-in period. And I think that's, I tried to do that very quickly to leave some time, but Brian, I'll turn it back to you. Or
yeah, no, that's great. No, I think that's a perfect overview, and pretty cool to have someone who is so deeply involved with it. So we do have a few questions, and I think we have some time to get to those. So I'll fire away a couple of these that have come in, Cameron. So the first one's pretty specific, but I'll put this on here. It asks, Mike asks, has LAE been approved in Canada as a processing aid? It was pending. If not, are there any sprayable antimicrobial processing aids?
I believe it has been approved, but I will have to double check on that. As far as I was concerned, it was approved, but I'll have to double check with Health Canada on that one.
Okay.
And provide that answer definitively.
Great. No, good. Thank you for that. And for those of you that are not aware, we do have a LinkedIn group, and usually what we'll do with any follow-up questions like that, we'll post the answers on there, so you can keep an eye on there, and that way everybody is able to see that. Another question that came up from Mark is a good one here. It says, what foods would be included for a U.S. company to apply for a license? I'm thinking of the food contact substance issues with FSMA, or within FSMA, sorry.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the reference to food contact substance issue, but certainly all foods and would be included. So that that include all ingredients, and it may include some packaging as well. But mostly it's food ingredients that we're talking about, final products. So I'm not sure I've answered the question, but certainly we can come back on that piece about the food contact substance issue if it adjusts the question.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, Mark, if we didn't quite get there, let us know with a little follow up here. We'll try and get to that. Caitlin is asking if we have a facility in Canada that imports into the U.S. and has a food safety plan that is FSMA compliant, would we be Safe Food for Canadians Act compliant?
Yes, you would be, although your Canadian facility would have to have a license under these rules, and they would have to apply for that license, and they have to demonstrate that they have a Preventive Controls program, which they would if they were FSMA compliant. So that's a simple answer. They would have to have a license, though.
Okay, so the license is the key there. Okay.
Yeah.
Abby has questions. Says, do you foresee allergen control being a requirement in the future?
Well, the allergen, I didn't mean to suggest that allergen controls are not a requirement in Safe Food for Canadians regulations. It's just that they're handled differently. In FSMA, you know, there is a lot of emphasis on allergens and verifications of allergen cleans and so on. It's really very equivalent outcome under Safe Food for Canadians Preventive Controls, in that the companies are expected to evaluate and assess allergen risks in their hazard analysis, and then establish programs to prevent cross-contamination. And they are expected to monitor the sanitation post-cleaning and before the next run of different allergen profile products. So all of that is actually already in there. So I don't see any changes being required. It's just I wanted to point out that it's handled a little bit differently under the preventive controls than it is in the U.S.
Got it. Okay, good. Thanks for the clarification on that. We've got one more question from Gail asking, is there immediate implementation required, or is there a draft of the document regulation available for review yet?
Okay, the implementation, it's going to be very much like FDA. FDA did not come out with a hard enforcement status or approach in the first year, and that will be similar in Canada. It will take a year or so. So the implementation, I would say, once these rules are published in the next few months, there will be an implementation phase, and that will take about a year. However, I would suggest that the application for a license happen as quickly as possible. There is a website, or actually an electronic portal called My CFIA that you can go into, and actually I don't know if it's quite up and running. It's partially running, but intention is very soon to be able to apply for your license through that electronic portal. It requires some, there's a lot of security around it because there's financial transactions happening through that portal. So look into that, and because it requires a bit of financial information and so on, but that's how you apply for your license. And so that, in terms of implementation, that needs to happen as soon as these rules are published, if you're in that group that needs immediate compliance.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Well, that's great, Cameron. We fired away some good questions. We've got a couple more that we'll take offline on LinkedIn, and with that in mind, if you're not part of our FSMA Fridays LinkedIn group, just go over to LinkedIn, search for FSMA Fridays. You'll see the group there, and we'll get you approved to get access. But it's a good spot where we take some of these questions offline and continue the conversation. But our goal is always to make sure we get everybody out on time. So if you have some more specific follow-up, there's a couple of you we're going to connect with Cameron and his team based on your questions. Obviously, they are the experts and can be a tremendous help in this area, whether it's around the rules and regs that are changing or actually building out your plans and dealing with compliance issues. So you can check them out at achesongroup.com. Also, as Cameron mentioned in the beginning, they have probably one of the best newsletters out there. So if you have at least one thing on your list to read a week, I would highly recommend subscribing to that. There's a lot of good stuff and a ton of content on their website. So certainly check them out and engage with them if need be. And on the software side, a lot of the implementation that our partners over at TAG do, in the trenches, we're able to complement on the software side and make this a lot more seamless, a lot faster, more productive. So if you're looking for areas to help complement the work that you're doing for compliance, whether it's around food safety or quality assurance or even on the supplier compliance side, we've got some exciting new stuff, and you can learn about that over at safetychain.com. And we have a pretty big announcement coming next week, so stay tuned for that as well. In terms of upcoming items here, again, a couple of you have asked, we will be sending out a session recording. Cameron, once again, you've piqued a lot of interest, so we're going to make sure and get the links and the deck out to everybody. So that'll be coming in the next day or two. We also have our Beyond Compliance webinar series, and this is kind of a special edition because we have Dr. Acheson coming on Monday as part of our webinar training. So he'll be doing a full live hour webinar with us around risk assessment. So if you have not registered for that, there are still some spots available. There's no cost to that, but a really great opportunity to get Dr. David Acheson's training, who is obviously very instrumental in starting this FSMA Friday program with us. So highly, highly recommend. You can learn more about that at our website at safetychain.com. And as I mentioned, the newsletter is a must-have. Next month, FSMA Friday will be on May 25th, so mark that on your calendar, and we'll send out our normal reminders for that. But with that, we want to thank all of you for joining us, continue to supporting it, and Cameron, thank you for putting together such great content. This was a wonderful session, and hopefully we'll be able to talk you into coming back soon.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and have a great weekend.